Okay, good morning, everyone. Before I get into the presentation and explain what I want to talk about, I'd like to just introduce myself a bit. I know a lot of the people here, but not everybody, and I'm still somewhat of a newcomer to this group. Not so new, but I've had a guide license for about 5 years, and I've been a member of this group, I think, since around then. So that's not so new, but compared to some of the Vatikim here that have been doing this for 25 or 30 or 40 years, I guess that makes me a newbie. But the reason, so I want to just give you a little bit about who I am and my background, primarily, first of all, because it's an opportunity, but also because I want you to understand where I'm coming from with this presentation and the methodologies that I'd like to share with you. I'm 52 years old, and as I just told you, I have a tour guide license for less than 5 years, which means that I got into this, I guess, what you could call mid-career. And what I did before that, I come from the field of Jewish education. I made Aliyah at the age of 30 in 1997. Prior to that, in the States, I was a high school teacher in a small yeshiva high school for modern Orthodox girls. I also was one of the directors of NCSY Youth Movement in New Jersey. Which means that I was involved both in formal and informal Jewish education. And then from literally the day I made Aliyah, I was the director of a seminary program, a midrashah, a gap year program for modern Orthodox young women as well, which still exists. It's called MMY. Those who live in Yerushalayim probably are familiar with the building on the corner of Derech Hebron and Esther Malka. It says MMY on the building. I was one of the founders of that institution, and I ran it for 16 years. And when I left at the age of 46, that's when I decided to take the tour guide course. And so for me, and now as well, by the way, I took 2 years off and I took the course, and now I guide professionally, but only part-time. I still am a teacher. I'm involved. I teach now in a different gap year program, a similar population run by Bnei Akiva called Bindresha Torah Avodah, where I'm also the tour guide. So I teach and I also take my own students on tours, and I also do some speaking and writing and other things like that. The reason I'm telling you all this is that for me, when I at the age of 46, when I left my position and I decided to go get a tour guide license, I got a lot of jokes about midlife crisis and things like that. And one of my friends used the expression to me. He said, "Oh, you're doing hasavat mikzoah, right? You're switching your career." And I said, "No, it's not hasavat mikzoah, it's harchavat mikzoah. It's an expansion of the career, because basically everything I do, I view as really, I bring with me the methodologies. I came into this already as a person who had been teaching in classrooms and informal context, and that's the way I look at everything I do when I guide. And therefore, what I'd like to try to share with you today is some methodologies that I've developed that I have found to be very, very effective when taking Jewish people around the country. I say Jewish people because I should say that also. Almost all the people I guide, with rare exceptions, are Jews, and the large majority of those are Orthodox Jews. Although I do guide certainly non-Orthodox Jews as well, and occasionally I guide non-Jews, but the non-Jews I guide usually come to me because they want to hear from a Jewish perspective. They want to hear from a rabbi or something like that. But my point is that I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation. I'll tell you in a second how and why I made it as well. But we'll be talking about specific sites, and anyone who wants to is welcome to use any of the material here at those sites. But that's really not the point exactly, because what I really want to show you is the way that I think you can approach these sites to make them very meaningful for the people you're guiding. And therefore, it's very possible that many of the ideas I'll share with you, you could use at many other sites in the country, other than the ones I happen to pick for here. And more importantly, even if it's not the same material, it's not the material that's important as much as the methodology and the approach. You also may need to adjust the messages somewhat to first of all, to your personal philosophy, whatever that is, and certainly to the audience that you're guiding. But I believe that's something that's very, very possible as well. This PowerPoint that I'm using, which I'm happy to share if anyone wants it, although I'm not sure how useful it'll be other than just to get the messages across. I prepared fairly recently, about 2 months ago or so. I was in the States back in the days when there used to be these things called airplanes and people could travel to other countries. So I did some speaking. I was a scholar in residence in a number of synagogues. And usually when I do that, I'm coming as a visiting rabbi. I mention that I'm a tour guide. I always bring Eretz Yisrael into things, but that's not usually the focus. However, this particular synagogue that I spoke at in Pittsburgh is a community that I had run a trip for a number of years ago together with the rabbi. He and I planned the trip together. It was a custom designed trip where he brought his congregants and gave classes to the people every day. And then we went on tours that were based on what he did. And please God, it should happen now with all the things going on. But I'm supposed to be running a similar trip for them in about 6 months, a second one. And basically the purpose of my Shabbat in Pittsburgh was to be like a promo for this trip. I spoke a number of times over Shabbat, and on Saturday night I gave I made this presentation, and the whole point was to try to push this idea with these people that you can come to Israel and it should be not only a vacation and not only something inspiring and meaningful, but something that really connects you to your Jewish experience in all sorts of different ways. And therefore, that's basically a perfect tool to share with you what I want to try to share with you. Having said that, you're all tour guides, and therefore I assume run through some of the details much more quickly, because what I really want to focus on is the methodology. Okay, so after that introduction, let's get right into it. The expression you see there on the page, the midrashic statement, "Ein Torah k'Torat Eretz Yisrael." And we have here a statement from the Talmud, a very, very dramatic statement that Rabbi Zera, one of the Babylonian rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud, actually fasted when he came to the land of Israel so that he would forget all of the Torah that he had learned in Babylonia, which is, I think, a pretty dramatic statement in its own right. I wouldn't recommend anyone actually doing that. I can speak for myself, at least, that for me, it's hard enough to remember what I've learned. I don't need to work very hard on forgetting it. But there is something very, very powerful in the statement there that that the idea that a person who studies Torah in the land of Israel, there's something about it that's just categorically different than the same thing everywhere else. When I talk to my students or to other students who come here to study in yeshivot or things like that, I often point out to them, I teach in a program where almost all the students come from North America. It would be a lot more economical to run the program there. We could fly over a few teachers instead of flying over all the students. But even if we had, and I ask the students, and they all instinctively get this, even though they can't really explain, I can't at least explain why. If you took all the same students and all the same teachers and all the same books, and you went to some campus in Vermont or something like that, and you had the exact same classes and the exact same discussions, somehow it just wouldn't be the same. There's something about studying Torah in the land of Israel, maybe it's metaphysical, that makes it different, and that's what Rabbi Zera was talking about. But beyond that metaphysical abstract reality, there are at least 3 different ways that I think a Jew can come to the land of Israel and can connect both intellectually and emotionally with his or her Jewish experience in a fundamentally different way than you can do anywhere else. Okay, so those are the three categories that you see there on the screen. First, we'll take a look at understanding Torah texts. We'll look at a few examples, and there are endless others, of course, where there are texts that we can study anywhere in the world in a classroom. And then when we come here and we go out to the shatach, as we say, suddenly those texts take on a new meaning that's difficult or impossible to understand anywhere else. That's number one. Then we'll move beyond the text and look at the land itself. The land of Israel is such a unique place. The physical land, I'm talking about the topography, the geology, the flora, the fauna, all these types of things that I think, at least, and maybe this is the most subjective part of the presentation, but I think contains all kinds of messages that we can see from the land itself. And then we'll talk about the people, the Jewish people, and the incredible history of the Jewish people that we have here. So if you want borrowing, I believe it was Rabbi Cook's tripartite, I'm not sure if he's the author of this, but Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, and Torat Yisrael. So in a slightly different order, that's what we're talking about here. Torat Yisrael, and then Eretz Yisrael, and Am Yisrael. So let's start with the first one, Torah texts. I'll give you just a few examples, which may or may not be familiar with you, but even if you are familiar, hopefully you'll get a sense of what I'm trying to do. And again, usually I use texts like this with people who are somewhat familiar with the text or could read them in the original Hebrew or things like that, although of course it can be adapted. So we have here a verse from the book of Bereshit, Vayishlachehu me'emek Chevron. The context here is Yosef. And as we remember the story from the book of Bereshit, Yosef's brothers are up north in the area of Shechem with the sheep, and Yaakov, Yosef's father, sends him on what he thinks is a fairly routine trip to go see how his brothers are doing. And of course, we know what's going to happen when Yosef gets there. He's going to be attacked by his brothers and sold into slavery. And the Torah makes what seems to be fairly trivial comment, Vayishlachehu me'emek Chevron. We know that Yaakov and Yosef were living in Hebron at the time. He sends him from Hebron. And what you're looking at here, what you're looking at over here, so this is the commentary of Rashi, who sat in France in the Middle Ages, never had the privilege that all of us have had to stand in these places and to see it with his own eyes, sitting in France in the Middle Ages with no maps either, no modern maps, no videos, no YouTube, none of that, Google Earth or anything of the sort. All he has is the texts. Sits there and he says, this is a funny expression, Emek Hebron, the valley of Hebron. And Rashi, who's never been to Hebron, said, well, Hebron is in a mountain. I know that, says Rashi, because I read the Torah very carefully, and in the book of Bamidbar, it mentions going up to Hebron. So I know that Hebron must be on a mountain, and yet the Torah calls Hebron a valley. What's going on? And Rashi, seeking to solve this, what he believes to be a textual anomaly, finds a midrash, which takes the word emek, which of course in Hebrew also means depth, right? Valley is a deep place. So sort of a play on words. Me'etza amuka shel oto tzadik hakavur bechevron lekayem ma shenemar l'Avram ben Abitarim. The deep insight of that righteous person who was buried in Hebron, and Rashi sees it as a reference to Abraham Avinu. And I have the sense that what Rashi seems to have understood from this was that he knows that Hebron is a mountain because he discerned that from a different text. The Torah refers to Hebron as a valley. And so he seems to, and he finds a midrash that he believes solves the problem by treating it essentially as a metaphor. Now, of course, you and I who've had the privilege of going to Hebron are aware that first of all, Rashi was correct. Hebron is on a mountain. But if we look at the source of the midrash that Rashi quotes, a midrash that was itself composed in the land of Israel, in other words, the authors of the midrash, unlike Rashi, had the privilege that you and I have to they knew what Hebron actually looks like. So if you read the text of the midrash here, it's fairly similar to what Rashi quotes, but it does not include Rashi's question, oh, Hebron is on a mountain. The midrash simply points to the word emek, and finds a midrashic meaning that connects it to Avraham. Now, here's, of course, Tel Hebron. I use that to show the people. These are, of course, we know the steps that quite likely Avram himself walked on, the steps that led to the city gate. And here's a map of modern Hebron. Here we have Tel Hebron, or Tel Rumeida as it's called, which is, of course, a mountain. And here we have Me'arat Machpelah, which even someone who comes today may not clearly recognize, because, of course, modern Hebron, like as all the ancient cities, is much, 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 much larger. But once you realize that Tel Hebron is the ancient city, you realize what should be fairly obvious, although I, for one, never thought of this until I began to study it and travel Eretz Israel, is that burial caves are not in the city, but rather outside the city, in the fields, as the Torah actually describes. And, of course, while Rashi is correct that Tel Hebron is a mountain, the city's on a mountain, the Me'ara itself is in the valley. Okay, it's hard to see from this picture, but anyone who's been there knows that when you stand on the top of Tel Hebron, you can look down very clearly. You can see the roof. You can see the Byzantine church that's built on top of the Herodian structure, and it's very clear that Rashi was right. Hebron is a mountain, but there's also a place called Emek Hebron. There's also a valley. And that Emek happens to be where Me'arat Machpelah is. Whoops. And therefore, this now gives a whole level of depth to the midrash that Rashi quoted that I'm not sure Rashi himself even, I don't know if you're allowed to say that even, it sounds almost arrogant. But we have a privilege that Rashi didn't. The midrash knew, the authors of the midrash knew that Hebron was on a mountain, and they also knew that there's a place called Emek Hebron. But what the Midrash was bothered by was why that. So apparently, what actually happened, and what the verse is telling us, is that Yaakov and Yosef lived in the city of Hebron, which is on the mountain. And when Yaakov sent Yosef to go to Shechem, apparently he accompanied him on the first part of the journey. They went down the hill together. In the valley, it's from there that he told him, okay, go and come back and tell me what's going on. And he sent him from the valley of Hebron, which is a trivial, apparently trivial detail that doesn't, like, why do we care exactly where he left him? And that's when the Midrash says, but look where he was standing. He was standing in the valley of Hebron, and buried not far from where he was standing is that righteous person, Yaakov's grandfather, who was given this prophecy. And while Yaakov and Yosef didn't realize, they thought that what was going on here was something very, very mundane and trivial. Actually, a meta-historic process was beginning, because what was happening at that moment was the beginning of the process that led to the descent of the children of Israel to Egypt and hundreds of years of slavery in Yetziat Mitzrayim and everything going on there, right? And all that prophecy that had been given was taking place right here. And the Midrash sees like a geographic reference there that once you're standing, and I tell this to people, I pull out a chumash, and I often do this standing where exactly from the view that you're looking at here, and suddenly the midrash comes to life. Another example from the book of Yoshua, right? Shemesh begivon dom v'yareach be'emek ayalon. Here's a painting from the 19th century, I believe. I think it was a German Christian who tried to envision this battle where Yehoshua's armies are fighting the Canaanite kings of the south, and dramatically Yehoshua turns to the sky and commands the sun and the moon to halt to stop, and a miracle happens, supernatural event. God listens to the command of man, and the sun and the moon stops, and the Israelite army wins the war. And I usually ask the people why they think this was necessary. What was Yehoshua trying to accomplish by asking God to perform this miracle? And the inevitable answer, what most people think, and what certainly I always thought, is that it must have been that the story tells how they've already chased the enemy, and the sun is about to set. It seems that the sun is about to set, and that Yehoshua is afraid that if the sun sets, the enemies will all get away and they'll be able to regroup and fight again. And if only he had a few more hours of daylight, he would be able to finish the job. And in fact, God does this miracle, and they manage to conquer half of the country basically in one day. But all of that is based on the assumption that, of course, it was near the end of the day, it was near sunset when Yehoshua stopped the sun. However, if, of course, you follow the path of Yehoshua's army from Yericho, the area of Yericho, Gilgal, right, up the mountain, they hiked this whole distance during the night. They surprised the enemies, their enemies, the armies of the south, who were camping opposite Givon near Nabi Samuel, chased them down Ma'ale Beit Choron, roughly today's Route 443, to the Ayalon Valley, to Emek Ayalon. It suddenly becomes clear, and this is something I do when I stand with people in Park Canada, often starting a tour at Nabi Samuel and then continuing to there. I often go up to the roof of the mosque in Nabi Samuel. I tell the people that Shmuel Hanavi is not buried here, but there's lots of other really interesting things that did happen here, including this battle, which you're opposite El Jib, opposite Givon, and I often start the story there, drive down 443, take the people into Park Canada to that lookout point, I think it's called Mitzpeh Ayalon, just over Mavo Choron. And I point out to the people, and then they usually get it. If Yehoshua stops the sun in Givon and the moon in Emek Ayalon, that means that this could not possibly have happened close to sunset. It has to have happened early, first thing in the morning. If the sun is in Givon, which is in the east, and the moon is in Emek Ayalon, which is in the west, Yehoshua did not issue this proclamation shortly before sunset. He issued it early in the morning when this moon was still visible opposite the rising sun. And then you have to ask why this was necessary. And there are a number of answers that are given. Some of the traditional commentaries did think of this. The Radak, I believe, addresses it, and others who knew enough about the geography. But I, for one, didn't get that until I was standing there. And most of my people that I bring there, I sometimes have to coach them a little bit. There's a problem here. What's the problem? But I don't usually have to give too many hints before somebody says, wait a second. I usually say something like, okay, let's just understand the geography. I'm looking north. That's east, west, south. Givon, you remember we were over there? And suddenly they get it. The answer is less important than the question. If I had time, I'd go through different answers. But the point is this. The point is, the text comes alive in a way that that it's difficult, if not impossible, to see unless you're standing there. That's just the land itself and the geography, and that's before we get into using the tools of modern archaeology to teach us some more things. And here I assume that people here don't need as much of an explanation as I gave the people in Pittsburgh, so I'll run through this a little bit quickly. Those who aren't familiar with the text that you're seeing here, this is a letter that was written by the Ramban Nachmanides in the Middle Ages when he came to Akko. There's a whole discussion in the Talmud about the biblical shekel and what the actual size of it is. And when he came here, he found a coin, not this one. This I just pulled off Google Images. I don't know the coin that he had, but he found a coin that said on it shekel hashkalim. It was written in Ktav Ivri, in the ancient Hebrew script. He couldn't read it, but they found a Samaritan who was able to read it, and based on that, he changed his ruling on what it is. And that's often recognized as the first halachic precedent for a decisor of Jewish law using tools of archaeology. This is in the 13th century to understand the Talmud and even issue halachic rulings as a result. Modern scholars think that the Samaritan might have misread the coin and the whole thing might have been off anyway, but the point is valid nonetheless. So I'll run through this part rather quickly. Here you have this. I explained to the people there, but these are the verses from both Divrei Yamim and Melachim discussing the preparations that King Chizkiyahu made for the impending attack of Sancheriv. And it talks here about things which, again, for much of history, must have been very, very difficult to understand. It talks about how he plugged up all of the springs and the river that flows, Hanachal HaShotef B'toch HaAretz, Brecha V'Atala. He brought the water into the city, and of course today we all are familiar with the tunnel and the ability to see exactly what Chizkiyahu did and why. And then, of course, I talk about the wall that was discovered in the old city that's also mentioned explicitly in the Tanakh. And I point out that first of all, there's a very powerful emotional and maybe some would call it spiritual value to reading these verses when you can almost reach out you can reach out and touch with your own hands the installations that the Tanakh is talking about. But also, I imagine that this is also not very far into most of you. But we have here the wall, and over here, as you can see very clearly, if you stand on the side of the broad wall that's closer to the square of the old city, of the Jewish quarter, how the wall here cut through houses that had been there before, and the verse from Yeshayahu that's often connected with that. And then you can learn this parak of Yeshayahu, and you can try to understand the social and moral messages that he was talking about here when Yeshayahu mentioned that you destroyed the houses to build the wall. These were probably the poor people who lived at the edge of the city, whose homes may have needed to be destroyed for engineering reasons, but did anybody consider making sure that those people had alternate places to live or whatever, and the wealthy versus the poor, and wherever you go with that. So that was another example of using Torah texts. Okay, so, and again, those are just samples, but you can, endless options you can do there. By the way, not only biblical texts, this is very commonly done, by pulling out the Tanakh, but of course it's not only the Tanakh, historical texts, Talmudic texts that discuss, certainly the war against the Romans and Bar Kokhba rebellion and stuff like that. But not only, you can also teach halachic texts on location. I did a whole tour once in Sataf, where I took Mishnayot from Seder Zraim on Shvi'it and Kilayim and Peah and Maaser Sheni, and I went through. We did a hike through the Sataf on one of the longer trails where you have all of the different traditional agriculture, and you can just sit there and you can study halachot. I did one this past Chanukah involving olive oil and any ancient olive press, which you can find anywhere in this country, and you can take out things in Mishnayot that you can learn. So there's really, really almost endless opportunities to study Torah texts on location, and depending on your audience, you just have to find the texts that are matim, and you open up the book and it comes to life. But we can also close the books, and now I get to the second part. And Eretz Yisrael itself, as I said, this is perhaps the most subjective part of this. You can tell me if you agree or disagree, but I think the land of Israel itself is very, very unique, right? Avram was told, Lech lecha me'artzecha, and he goes, and he shows up in the land of Israel, and he's told by God, this is your land, this is the land I will give to your descendants. And I ask, if Avram would have looked around at that time, what would he have seen? Right? He gets to the land of Shechem, and he's told, this is the land I'm giving to your descendants, and he wants to know, okay, what is this land before anything's been built here? I mean, there's Canaanites living in the land, but all the sites, all the historical sites that we show our visitors, all the biblical stories, none of that had happened yet. He's just coming to a land, and God tells him, this is your land. If he would have had the opportunity to study the land itself, what would he have seen? And the truth is, the land of Israel is a tiny country, but an incredibly unique place. Just physically. First of all, here you have a rabbinic statement that it's Tibura Shel Olam, it's the center of the world. And perhaps the rabbis meant that somehow spiritually, but it's also true, as we know, geographically, right? We sit at the crossroads of three continents. And of course, all the ancient roads from Mesopotamia to Egypt, the two centers of at least this civilization, this part of the world. Of course, there were civilizations in other places, in China, in North and South America, maybe in Africa, southern parts of Africa, but certainly this area where at least Western civilization comes from, the land of Israel is right in the middle of it. You could point this out, by the way. I remember when this hit me back when I was taking the tour guide course. I was in Eilat. At the bird watching, the Merkaz Saparut in Eilat, they took us there on the course, and whoever was guiding us there told me a fact that I had heard at that point for the first time, which is that we have 500 million birds, right? 500 million birds that migrate through the land of Israel twice a year. He said at the time it's the second highest number anywhere in the world. Only Panama gets more for similar reasons, because Panama also, right, is a very narrow land bridge connecting North and South America, and the birds need a place where they can land, where they can eat, where they can, drink water. So they can't land in the sea and they can't land in the desert. So they all birds going from all over Europe and Asia heading down south to Africa have to all, mitnakez here through this narrow strip that we call Eretz Israel. And me sitting there, from my perspective, all of a sudden this midrash popped up in my head, and I said, wow, the rabbi said the land of Israel is the center of the world, and even the animals know it. Even the animals know it. If you want to get from anywhere in the north to anywhere in the south, all roads pass through the land of Israel. So that's the first thing. But we also have this passage here from the book of Devarim, which mentions that the land of Israel is a land of hills and valleys. And I'll come back to this verse in a minute. But of course, we know that the land of Israel is a land of hills and valleys. We don't have the highest mountains. We do have the lowest valleys, right? The lowest place on earth, on land. But we certainly have nowhere near the highest mountains, even in this region, let alone in the world. But we do have an incredible array of different climatological zones. I don't know what the word is exactly, right? We're all familiar with this. I often say to people, where else in the world? Someone told me this may be true in Southern California also, I don't know. But how many places at least on one day without an airplane can you go skiing and swimming on a beach and walking in the woods? And if you got up early enough in the morning, you can get a quick desert hike in also, all in one day without an airplane. You can easily do that certain times of the year here in the land of Israel. And so here I show the people all the different possibilities we have: waterfalls in the Golan, and snow on the Hermon and the Carmel, and beaches and cities and deserts, right? All of these things cramped into one tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of land the size of New Jersey. And this brings me to a comment, a beautiful midrash that you may or may not be familiar with. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai referred to the Hebrew word tevel, right, which in biblical Hebrew means the world, Lashem ha'aretz u'meloat tevel v'yosheva, the world. And he said midrashically that the word tevel can mean the land of Israel. Literally it means the entire world, but it can be taken to refer to the land of Israel. So in other words, the land of Israel is a microcosm of the entire world. And he says, why? Shehi mituvelet bakol, from the word tavlin, spices. The land of Israel is spiced up by everything. And look at this beautiful expression that's highlighted in yellow there. Shekol ha'aratzot yesh bizo ma she'ein bizo. Every country has something that you can't find anywhere else. Every country, yesh bizo ma she'ein bizo. Aval Eretz Yisrael eina chasera klum. But Eretz Yisrael is lacking nothing. Shenemar lo techsar kol ba. Nothing is lacking here. You shall lack nothing here. And again, he probably meant that spiritually, and I'm sure it is true spiritually. But as tour guides who travel the land and are able to show this to people, it's true also physically. We don't have the biggest of everything, but whatever you want, you can find a little of it. One of the places I gave this lecture was in Canada. Canada, there's lakes everywhere. Everywhere you turn, massive lakes. The Great Lakes, you can't see from one to the other. We don't have that. But if you want a lake, we have a lake. We have forests, we have deserts, we have cities, we have towns, we have farmland, we have whatever you want, a little bit of it is here. It's as if the land of Israel is a microcosm of the entire world, at the center of the world. And again, I think that has tremendous spiritual significance. Wherever you take that, you'll take that. I take it to be connected to the role of the Jewish people and the universal messages that we have to bring, but that's already a matter of interpretation. The point is, these are things that if you draw people's attention to it, it's certainly noteworthy. And although we have things that are found all over the world, there's certain unique aspects of this land itself. So this is the verse that I mentioned earlier, which in the book of Dvarim, Moshe Rabbeinu, when speaking to the people who are about to enter the land of Israel, he tells Judy, are we on a 40-minute time limit here, or is
no, we're not on a 40-minute. But if you're going to go over an hour, I need to know.
No, I don't think so. I don't think it'll be more than an hour. I've only been going a half an hour. No, another 10, 15 minutes tops. Okay. So, I mean, unless there's questions and comments, but at least we'll see. Okay. So, Moshe Rabbeinu is leading the people into the land of Israel. Whoops, I just gave something away there. Okay, we'll get back to that weather map in a second. And he tells them something that seems a little bit odd, especially when you take into account that if you read the book of Dvarim carefully, it seems that one of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu was most concerned about at the end of his life, he's talking to the second generation now in the 40th year, people who were born or grew up in the desert, whose only the eldest people around had been in Egypt as children. A new generation's about to go into the land. He's going to die, and Yeshua is supposed to lead them into the land. And if you read Dvarim carefully, he's very, very, very worried. In a few places in Dvarim, this comes out, that also at the end of Bamidbar, that he's very concerned that perhaps they not repeat the mistake of the previous generation, the sin of the spies, and he's worried that they're not going to want to go into the land of Israel. And here he tells them something which is seemingly counterintuitive. He tells them, by the way, the land of Israel is a little bit different than Egypt. In Egypt, you never have to worry about water. Egypt has the Nile. It doesn't rain in Egypt. Egypt's a desert, but it doesn't matter. Modern Egypt has tremendous water problems, but that's only because the sources of the Nile are stopped up in Ethiopia and I think in Sudan also. But naturally speaking, the Nile River is a huge river that overflows its banks every spring, and there's never a problem of water. In the Bible, whenever there was a famine in the book of Bereshit, they're always going down to Egypt, right? And here he says, the land of Israel is not like that. This is the verse we saw earlier. Eretz Harim Uvkaot. It's a land of hills and valleys. Limtar hashamayim tishteh mayim. And therefore, if you need water, you're going to have to wait for it to rain. And of course, if it rains, that's great. And if not, then you're in trouble. That's a strange thing for Moshe to say to them when he's trying to encourage them. But he explains that there's a point to this. Eretz asher Hashem Elokecha doreshota. It's a land that God is watching over very carefully. Tamid enei Hashem Elokecha ba mereshit hashana ve'ad acharit shana. Now, we all know that the land of Israel is in need of rain. But if you look at, and of course, this is not only just about coming to the land of Israel, it's about the tools of modern science to see it. But these are actual weather maps. And let's take a look at the this is a tip. This is from I just pulled this off YouTube. You see how the cloud patterns having to do with the winds and the pressure systems. There's this like curvature motions. The clouds come in off the Mediterranean, and let me restart this because I want you to see it again from the beginning. How the storm begins, the clouds come in off the Mediterranean. There's like this counterclockwise motion where they're kind of hooking around, and they go up to the north, which is why the lands north of us have plenty of rain. Lebanon and certainly Turkey. Turkey has so much rain they don't know what to do with the water. A number of years ago, before we started desalinating water, if you might remember, one of the solutions when we thought our friends were in Turkey, so there was a talk of even shipping water here from Turkey or building a pipeline. So north of us is plenty of water. South of us, the Sinai and Egypt are all deserts, and we're right on the border. And that's what happens when things go well. But if you look at this next weather map, you'll see a different possibility. If the clouds kind of just take the curve slightly differently, they go straight up to the north, and they sort of skip over the land of Israel almost completely. Okay, so we are in the exact location where slightly north of us there's plenty of rain. Slightly south of us is a desert, and you can only live in places where you don't need rain, like Egypt, where the entire Egypt was built. If you look at a map of Egypt, even today, the entire Egypt is built along the banks of the Nile and in the Nile Delta, because they can't rely on rain. So they live in a place where they don't need rain. Or north of us, Turkey and also Syria and places like that, the whole Fertile Crescent, they have plenty of rain. And the land of Israel is exactly on the borderline, where if the clouds, it's all a matter of and even this year, thank God we were blessed. I saw before we started, we were talking about the Kinneret almost full after 2 years of wonderful rains. But at the beginning of this winter, if you remember, after Sukkot, there was a dry spell. I think the whole month of November, there was very little rains, and people were talking about it's going to be a drought this year again. We were worried. 6 years we had drought. Last year we had, thank God, a good winter. And a few months ago, there was fear that we were going back into drought. And now we're just counting the days till they open Sechet Ganya so that Tveria doesn't get flooded. That's because the weather here is so incredibly unpredictable, because it's just a matter of a few kilometers between where the rain falls and where it doesn't fall. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu meant when he said this is a land where God is directly controlling it. And you can give scientific explanations for all of this, of course. But a believing person sees that there's a God upstairs who's controlling these scientific phenomena. And the land of Israel is a place where your dependence on God through the rain is just built into the climate of the place. A couple more examples of things you can see in the land itself. Midbar Yehuda. The Judean desert is just such a fascinating place. A desert right next to Yerushalayim. And we have all sorts of spiritual significance to that. There's at least one mitzvah in the Torah that requires a desert right next to Yerushalayim. I assume you can figure out from the picture, this is Yom Kippur, and that is the Seir HaMishtalech, Seir LaAzazel, the scapegoat, whatever that ceremony means and whatever you do with it, however you understand it. And if you do understand it, please explain it to me at some point, because I can't fully get it myself. But the point is that it certainly involves this element of a desert right next to Yerushalayim. And of course, we know the concept of a rain shadow desert, which is not unique to the land of Israel, but it's a somewhat rare phenomenon that you have an area over here that gets a tremendous amount of rain. Here are the tops of the mountains, including Yerushalayim, which is fairly near the watershed and so close to it a desert. And it's because of this dramatic drop. This is an actual graph of the elevations, I guess, from sea level to Mediterranean Sea up to the Judean mountains, which reach approximately 1,000 meters above sea level, and then drop to Yam HaMelach, which I don't like to call the Dead Sea. It's not dead. Unfortunately, it's dying, but it's not dead at all. It's a tremendous source of life, always has been. So I prefer the Hebrew Yam HaMelach. I call it the Salt Sea. But in any case, you have a drop here of over a kilometer of altitude in about 15 or 20 kilometers of distance. And that, of course, here you have this nice little cute picture that explains how as the clouds come off the Mediterranean, it rains here. And then there's a sudden drop where the temperature rises and they stop. And then they rise on the other side. And what that gives you is a desert, which is, on the one hand, a genuine desert with very little rain. Anyone who wants these pictures, I'll be happy to send you can find them on the internet also, but I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint. What you have here is a desert. And on the one hand, is a desert with very little rain. But on the other hand, it's a tiny desert. It's a friendly desert. First of all, you can cross it in a few hours, less than a day, even on foot. Because there's a lot of water that falls, very little water falls in the desert, but both in the mountains of Yehuda on one side and the mountains of Moab and Jordan on the other side, there's lots of rain, so there's lots of underground water. You have lots of oases, Yericho, in Feshcha, in Gedi, in Bokek, and others. And it's a place that people can actually live in, both Jews, and we have here one example of David HaMelech, who wrote one of his Prakim of Tehillim, Behiyoto b'Midbar Yehuda, and he sees the physical sparseness of the deserts, right? Tzama lecha nafshi, kama lecha besari, beretz tzia v'ayef bli mayim. he connects that physical thirst that he was feeling in the desert with a spiritual the spiritual thirst that he feels. David was also running away at this point in time. But this is just one example of a person who goes out to the desert and finds God. And of course, you have here on the left a picture of one of the monasteries. I think, is that St. George? I think so. Right? But it's not only Jews who have found spirituality in the Judean desert. And I think it's of great significance. And when you study the science of it, according to geologists, there was no desert there until 20 million years ago, which in geological terms is not even yesterday, it's like a second ago in geological terms, like literally, I often refer to, let's use the term Sheshet Yemei Bereshit as a biblical synonym for what modern science calls the 12 billion years of the universe's existence. So these 20 million years of the existence of Midbar Yehuda is Erev Shabbat Ben HaShmashot, right? As humanity is emerging, and God's putting the finishing touches on creating the world, he says, I need a desert next to the holy city. So he puts one there through this unique phenomenon. And also Yam HaMelech, which itself is such a unique phenomenon. That truly is unique in the world. Second saltiest lake in the world. All the minerals. As I said, it's not a Dead Sea at all. It's a tremendous source of life. It has, since antiquity until now, even today, we have 3 major industries that are producing tremendous amounts of income for the state of Israel. Both the chemical industry, right, the Dead Sea minerals, and the cosmetics industry and tourism, all of which are in great jeopardy because the sea is not dead, but it is dying, and nobody's really doing anything to save it, and which is also a topic worthy discussing with people. But whatever it is, this is something that's all part of this unique place that we call Eretz Yisrael. Just one more example, which I'll run through quickly. The Machteshim, I gave people a whole explanation of how a Machtesh is formed, and we don't need to redo Course Morei Derech here. But one of the things that you see in the Machtesh is that, as of course you know, each of these layers is a different geological time period. Here you have a dike coming up from under the ground. But basically, one way to look at a Machtesh is that, and it's a unique phenomenon which exists only in the land of Israel. There's one or two also in the Sinai on the other side of the contemporary border between Israel and Egypt, but it's all part of the broader region that we call Eretz Yisrael. And one way to look at it is as if, again, this is my take on it. You can interpret it differently, but I'm just trying to show you like the types of things I do. I take people Machtesh Ramon on a nature tool, and I do some of these explanations, and I just point out it's as if Hashem said to us, "You want to see how I created the world? I'll show you." And He opened up for us the earth. And He gave us a snapshot of Maaseh Bereshit, studied a little bit, and you'll see the sandstone and the limestone on top of it, the volcanic rock coming up from underneath, and you can understand how I created the world. Okay, so those are some examples about studying the land itself. And lastly, I'll do this part kind of quickly, just to give you the point. I tell people, a number of years ago, I took a number of my students on a trip. I didn't take this picture. Unfortunately, I didn't think to take a picture at the time. I took them to Mitzpeh Alumot, overlooking the southern Kinneret, approximately the view that you see here in the picture. And we were standing there. It was a nice sunny day, and I showed them, this very beautiful view of the Kinneret, and you see below the kibbutzim, and you see the road, and there may have been some boats on the lake, and cars and trucks, and fields, and a little forest. Or woods at least. And then, of course, I told them, I just gave it away, but I told them that, 150 or so years ago, a group of Christians came here from the United States, and we know about them because one of them was, of course, Mark Twain. And here we have, of course, the famous passage from Innocents Abroad, where he describes something that looks very different than what you see today, right? Standing looking at this, we read this, right? And these dim waters, yellow hillocks of rock, devoid of perspective, unpeopled deserts, rusty mounds of barrenness, and of course the stupid village of Tiberias with its 6 funereal plumes of palms. And later on he mentions also that there was one other tree on the opposite side of the lake, and that was pretty much it. And today it looks a little bit different. And I quoted here one of my teachers, Rav Yoel Binun, who likes to point out that whether he realized it or not, and he may have realized it because he was a Christian who was familiar with the Bible, already built in the very, very beginnings of Degania over here at, what's it called, Unjuni, I think, right? Over here. But you see that even then, other than these buildings that had been put up fairly recently, it still looks pretty much like what Mark Twain had described a little bit earlier. And today, and then I took out the book of Yechezkel, and I read this in the prophecy, where Yechezkel also prophesizes that the mountains will become desolate, but that eventually the mountains will bloom again. And it's this verse here, which the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin says, Ein lecha ketz megule mizeh. This is the clearest sign that the redemption is coming. Vatem harei Yisrael. When you see this verse fulfilled, says the Talmud, it means that the redemption is coming. When you see, Yechezkel turns to the barren mountains, and he says to them, An pechem titenu perichem tisu. Give branches and give fruit. La'ami Yisrael ki kervu lavo. Because my people are coming home. And he continues, your people will come back. And he speaks to the mountains. I will come back to you, mountains. V'ne'evaditem v'nizratem. You shall be plowed again. You shall be planted again. V'beiti aleichem adam. And people will come back and live on you again. Kol beit Yisrael kulo. V'noshvu he'arim be'echaravoti banena. The cities will be established and the ruins will be rebuilt. And then I explained to them that, in my view, just like Mark Twain, whether he knew it or not, was fulfilling a biblical prophecy. So these young pioneers who came and built Chatzar Kineret, and after this we actually went to a visit there and we heard about Rachel HaMishoreret and Naomi Shemer and the people there, and the people started the Ganya and the whole kibbutz movement and all of that. So in my view, at least, as religious Zionists, they were also fulfilling this prophecy. And then I could just go through, and I did this very, very quickly, but how you could tell the story of the Jewish people, the incredible story of the Jewish people. Here we have, ancient times going back to the days of Avraham, and of course to the days of the first temple in Ir David, and the second temple and the destruction. This is, of course, the Davidson Center, the Churban, and later on the Mishnah, Beit Sharim, Tzipori, Tveria, and then you could talk about Galut. I often, I do a trip with my students every year, by the way, where in the program that I teach on now, like in many of the gap year programs, the young ladies, during the year, there's a trip to Poland where about 2/3 of the girls usually go to Poland. And there's usually around a third or so that don't go for one reason or other on that trip. And parallel to that trip, I run a trip in the land of Israel. I take them around the country and we go through Jewish history, basically. When we come to Akko, we sit there and we pull out, here you have like actual Crusader buildings, and we pull out texts, we read about things that happened to the Jewish people when they were in exile, such as the terrible massacres here. We're entering the days of Sfirat HaOmer, when the Jews of Ashkenaz were massacred by the Crusaders. You could talk about the exile also from the things you see in the land of Israel. And then, of course, eventually the return, the first Aliyah, and the second Aliyah, and the third Aliyah, the British Mandate period, and Medinat Yisrael. I live in Gush Etzion, so if I'm going to talk about 1948 and 1967, I do it most passionately in my own backyard. That's the Alona Boded, of course. And finally, we come back to contemporary Israel, seeing that you can't see today right now. Unfortunately, the shuk is closed, but hopefully it will reopen soon. And in my mind, this is when I get very emotional. I read verses like these when talk about the biblical prophecies that we see coming through in front of our eyes. God will gather you from all the nations where he has scattered you. And basically you can see the fulfillment of these prophecies on the streets of any city in Israel. Today, Jews who've come from around the world, millions of Jews coming back to Eretz Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically those were the three. Let me just go back to that. Oh, I closed the window. Okay. The three slides that I had, that I guess I could stop sharing. Oh, I did stop sharing. I see. Okay, so 1 second. Let me just get myself back here. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to share with you. I showed you three different, and again, everything I said here was just examples, but three different approaches that you can take, or three different methodologies, or that you can use. First, studying texts in the land itself, and gaining insights into those texts that would be in some cases impossible, or at least much more difficult to get elsewhere. Sometimes just from the geography of the land and the topography and things you can see, and even more so with the tools that we now have with archaeology and history to study the land in great depth, and then to connect those with the text, be they biblical texts, be they historical texts, be they halakhic texts, or others. We also look later in the presentation at Tehillim, for example, and studying things that have to do with nature in the environment in which they were written certainly gives a depth of understanding to that. Then we talked about the land itself and all the really unusual and fascinating things. And again, I could have talked about the volcanoes in the Golan, and I could have talked about the Galil Elyon, and I could have talked about lots of other things. I mentioned Midbar Yehuda and Yam HaMelech and the Negev, the Machteshim, things you could see from the land itself. And finally, so that was Torat Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, and finally the story of Am Yisrael, the incredible, mind-blowing drama that's taken place here from ancient times to the modern state of Israel, and in my mind, that's all connected. Let me just see. I opened up the chat window just now. It was Mar Saba. It wasn't. Okay, thank you for that. The correction. Okay, thank you for the compliments. I've heard the interpretation that the sun's setting in the west, but yes, that's one of the interpretations that I share. Also, I prefer though the interpretation that suggests that this miracle of Yoshua was really not so much like a number of the miracles in the beginning of the book of Yoshua. It's a miracle that wasn't really necessary to solve a problem, but more to send a message, like the splitting of the Yarden and like the conquering of Yericho. But whatever, it's one of those things where the question is more important than the specific answer. Okay, if there's any comments or questions or anything.
Yes, can I say something? All right. Sure. First of all, thank you very much. It was wonderful. I just wanted to add one thing. I'm sure you know it, but maybe some of the other people don't. When you talked about text coming to life, what I love to do when I go to Kever Rachel is bring the very famous Ramban. Now, I'm sure you know that pasuk. It says that, where does Yaakov bury her? Kivrat derech lavo beit lechem. And the word kivrat is a hapax legomenon, which means it only occurs once in the Tanakh. So how do we know what it means? Because we're always told it's by context. So there are different pirushim. Rashi says kivrat is a measure of distance. The Radak says no, it comes from para, which means to eat. And we all know when you go with donkeys, whatever, you're traveling, you leave very early in the morning because you want to go as much as possible before the heat of the day rises, and you eat breakfast later on. So what's Kivrat Derech? It's the place where you stop for breakfast on your journey. Ramban looks at both explanations. He says, I like Radak better. I'm going to go with Radak. Kivrat Derech is where you have breakfast. Well, what happens is, as we know, Ramban has to escape from Spain, after his disputation, comes to Akkad, then goes to Yerushalayim, and goes down. On the way to Hebron, he goes to Beit Lechem. He stopped at Kever Rachel, and he says, oops, I was wrong. I wasn't on location, and therefore I didn't understand. It's not possible that you would stop for breakfast so close to where you left. It can't be. I'm switching my mind. I'm not going with Radak, I'm going with Rashi. Kivrat must mean a measure of distance. And I think that is the best, because I'm not quoting myself, I'm quoting one of the Rishonim.
Right.
You have to be on location.
Right. It's the same Ramban who I brought the other example. Right.
That's what made me think about when you quoted the Ramban in the other place. I thought of this. And if I could just add one more thing, and I have to thank Tova for this. Tova organized recently a tour to Rishon LeZion. And one of the places we stopped at was at the Urfali Shu in Rishon LeZion. Now, I'd never heard this before. I was blown away. But I always show also in the National Highway, I show the map that you showed, Urkasim and Bavel, going up, the map through Eretz Israel. And then we went to the Urfali Shu, and I see that the Urfalims claim that Ur is in Urfal in southern Turkey. And first I said, oh, come on, give me a break. But then I saw Rav Meidan in that film.
Yes, Rav Meidan and also Rav Yoel.
Was speaking about, he supports it too. And I'm saying maybe it's time to redo our maps. Maybe it's time to look at where did Abraham come from in a whole different way, which was Haran right on his journey. So that's not to do with your thing, but just how something interesting.
I didn't go into that, but Rav Yoel agrees with Rav Meidan on that as well. That Ur is not Ur. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't hear him speak about it. Anyway, that was it. But thank you very much. It was wonderful. Really enjoyable.
Okay, wonderful. Rabbi Alan Haber, thank you very, very much. This was fabulous. And tomorrow we have Gil Regev is doing part 2, which will be the water series of 100 years of water in Eretz Yisrael. Same time, 11:30 tomorrow, and we look forward to it. Thank you, everybody. Have a fabulous Easter.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Very interesting.